A horror renaissance began on June 7, 2018 with the release of a horror masterpiece, Hereditary, a haunting story about a grieving mother which with only one jump scare proves to be more daunting than any horror film of the last decade. Later that year, Luca Guadagnino released his spiritual successor to the 70s horror classic Suspiria, which started a film movement in the 70s and 80s defining a new genre known as Giallo. It was a cultural phenomenon, and even today, horror films still draw inspiration from the work of Suspiria director Dario Argento.
Right behind Reggie.
So when Luca Guadagnino, a critically acclaimed director, tapped into the horror industry, it was very exciting. And his Suspiria calls back to the classics, using bone-chilling imagery, visceral performance, and atmospheric tension to create something horrific, much like Ari Aster's Hereditary.
I just want to die.
Horror movies like It, Get Out, and even The Conjuring films all saw huge box office success, and while they're enjoyable scary movies that receive decent critical acclaim, they're just not as scary because they're not as relatable. Hereditary and Midsommar are so daunting because the audience can relate to the characters through the central theme of grief. Before even the title sequence of Midsommar, I was already locked in emotionally because I could relate to Danny's grief, as just about anyone can, as every adult has been through at least something traumatic. Danny mourning her family's death and learning to accept the end of her relationship is a very real situation, which makes the rest of this bizarre film hit home. Or in Hereditary, a mother mourning her daughter's death. Another realistic situation gone absolutely wrong. Both these films are grounded in reality. They are dramas first, then horror films. But this video isn't an analysis of Ari Aster's movies because there's already tons of videos breaking these films down, and those videos are worth looking into. While I will be talking about Hereditary and Midsommar, as well as other films like The Babadook, I want to discuss a film you may never have heard of. The 1973 masterpiece Don't Look Now, considered to be one of the greatest psychological horror films of all time. And perhaps through this classic, we can learn what makes Hereditary, or Suspiria, so horrifically mesmerizing. Spoilers ahead. Let's think back to 2013's The Conjuring, a horror film I admittedly enjoy. It initially ranked in my top 10 favorite for that year, but as my tastes have matured, I've found a couple issues with it. Only 10 minutes into the film, and we find these characters whose names you don't remember. They are playing an extra spooky version of hide and seek, and we get our first jump scare. The first of many. There is considerably minimal time spent developing Roger and Carol because the movie doesn't care about them. The film is overtly scary because that's what it's good at. Experiencing The Conjuring is like playing Minesweeper, but instead of bombs, it's freaking demons.
There's someone behind the door.
What?
And honestly, James Wan is the best when it comes to this type of experience. But it gets old. The Conjuring doesn't continue to scare me because I know exactly what to expect. Its fear factor is surface level. Maybe these are the only types of horror films you've ever seen, and perhaps Midsommar isn't your style. Truthfully, it's not for everybody. It's a wholly uncomfortable experience that sinks into your skin. In a world of modern horror movies, this type of unconventional experience borders on the edge of even psychological horror. But isn't that the whole point? Don't all the greatest horror films break down the boundaries of their genre? Midsommar, just like Don't Look Now, begins as a drama. Opening with a devastating glimpse into Danny's past, we discover her parents were murdered by her sister. After which we get another 50 minutes of character development before anything shocking happens. Instead of jump scares, we are presented with questions that build tension. Why does Pele want Danny to come to Sweden? How badly does Christian dislike Danny? And is Danny as crazy as her fucked up sister? Good questions are the basis of any psychological horror because it keeps the audience on their toes without being The Conjuring, without being overtly scary. This is one aspect of Don't Look Now that is done in the most masterful way I've ever experienced. 40 minutes into the film, and Caitlin quietly asked me, "Are you sure this is a horror movie?"
Yes. Is that all right? I make no promises. No.
Don't Look Now opens with a shot slowly zooming in on a lake, successfully posing its first question: what the hell is up with this lake? We are introduced to the peaceful household of John and Laura Baxter. John is looking at slides of old churches, specifically mosaics. He notices a figure in a red hood, and suddenly his persona changes. Something's wrong. He rushes to the yard and finds his daughter dead, wearing a red hood. Grief, the subject of this video and the driving force in this film, begins with a shot of Donald Sutherland flexing his acting chops. Then we cut to somewhere else, at a different time. John is at work at what seems like Venice. He meets his wife for lunch, and there's something wrong with her. Is she grieving for her daughter? Is this before the incident or after? Why are they in Venice? The beginning of this film does two things brilliantly. First, it introduces its characters and their environment, subtly foreshadowing to future events before heartbreak strikes, inviting grief into the picture. Secondly, it uses one quick, perfectly placed cut to introduce a wave of questions. While there's nothing immediately wrong, we already have questions, and the movie is purposefully not answering them. And all this happens within the first 8 minutes. Grief is a quick way to get an audience to care for characters, but you need good actors to make it believable. Something you just won't find in most modern horror films is good actors.
That goes without saying.
Super funny, like, whoa.
Annie's character in Hereditary wouldn't have been the same without Colette's incredible, underappreciated performance. This intense level of darkness surrounding her grieving and how she handles these emotions in the worst way possible is partly why this experience is so legendary. The Babadook, a 2014 horror film, uses grief in a different way. Amelia, a recent widow, reads her son a book called Mr. Babadook, and before realizing its evil secret, summons a terrifying monster that attempts to kill her son Sam, even possessing Amelia to carry out this act. It's not till the end of the film, when Sam and Amelia learn to tame the Babadook, that the revelation is realized. The famous ending shot of her feeding the monster in her basement reveals that this monster is her depression. And because she's now in control of these feelings, she's no longer scared of this monster. And perhaps there just never was a monster. She was the one actively trying to kill her son because he reminded her of her dead husband. Don't Look Now uses grief in its own way. The time jump occurring in the perfect cut signifies the Baxter's time of mourning. We've moved far enough in the future to where John now believes it's time to move on. Laura is now on depression medication to help ease her coping. Grief, in this case, works as a hidden driving force in their decision-making, eventually leading to conflict. The main conflict begins with an old lady named Heather who tells Laura she saw their dead daughter, Christine, sitting with them, and that she's happy.
And she wants you to know that she's happy.
This news is emotionally liberating for Laura, who feels as if she can finally move on. She's emotionally unstable, and she's just ready to accept answers. John thinks it's nonsense. It's apparent that he's shutting out his grief and trying his best to just move on, and this psychic is the last thing he needs. But the situation gets worse when Heather claims that John has the psychic gift of foresight.
He has the gift. Well, that's why the child was trying to talk to him. He has the gift. Even if he doesn't know it.
The film's atmospheric tension, created with quick cuts and a sense of urgency, is parallel with John's paranoia, which grows stronger the closer Laura becomes with Heather. John begins seeing things. He starts seeing a red-hooded figure hiding in dark places. He's becoming suspicious of his wife, who he believes is conversing with their dead daughter. His paranoia is a product of his avoidance of grief. It's the same reason he wants Laura to stay on depression medication. He's afraid of the thought of Christine. As the tension builds, John and Laura's relationship is tested, and their stability continues to shatter.
She does not come peeping with messages back from behind the fucking grave. Christine is dead. She is dead. Dead, 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 dead.
I'd like to point out, though, that there are still moments of subtle beauty, contrasting the growing weight of the story. A brilliant, soothing reminder that this is still grounded in the beautiful reality of Venice, and it makes what happens next feel much more real. All the questions, all the time spent developing these characters is ultimately meant to collide in a pivotal, often fatal climax. Hereditary's ending will always give me chills. While it's a very dark film throughout, darkness takes full control in the climax. Annie's body is now inhabited by the spirit of her occult mother, whose main goal is to prepare Alex for the Demon King Paimon. Just explaining that sounds absolutely bonkers. It's wild, devastating, and one of the scariest things I've ever seen because I care about Alex. I care about Annie. The ending of The Conjuring isn't all that great, considering the first jump scare was only 10 minutes into the film and that these scares escalate by getting louder and darker, and by the end of the film it's reached such an overtly, over-the-top, embarrassing level of scary that it's just not effective. It's just too loud. I'm a goofy goober! Midsommar has considerably the best climax of all these films. As we realize the actual malicious intent of this festival, and as each character slowly falls deeper into their own rabbit hole, the experience is pulsing with anxiety. It's an achievement in uncomfortable filmmaking. I will never, ever forget the faces of the disgusted people exiting our theater when the climax begun. I was thinking to myself, what did you expect? Were you hoping for a happy ending, or is a giant orgy with old ladies just too much for your wee mind to handle? Danny, who the movie is all about, has a complete character arc. She's crowned the May Queen. She's welcomed into a new family, who she accepts, and the final act of her watching her ex-boyfriend burn alive symbolizes her commitment to this new family. And if we think back to the beginning, and we ask ourselves again, why did Pele want Danny to come to Sweden? We know the answer. Because he knew she'd find a family there, which is what she's wanted. It's what she wanted from Christian. As Midsommar is Danny's story, Don't Look Now is John's. John continues to fall down his own rabbit hole of paranoia. When the Baxters receive word that their son was injured while in boarding school, Laura has to depart for Britain to go care for him. Later that day, after her plane has already left, John spots her with the sisters looking particularly grim. Unable to find her or contact her, he goes to the police, who seem very suspicious of him, but still play along with his request to bring in the sisters. When they finally detain Heather for kidnapping Laura, John receives a call from her. She's in Britain with their son. They are okay. The climax of the film occurs entirely in John's head, which also shapes the film's perspective. Venice is no longer beautiful, it's dark and shabby, symbolizing his state of mind. He's more confused now than ever, and his grief begins to surface, just as he spots the red-hooded figure. Needing answers and being the ignorant protagonist that John is, he pursues that figure. And instead of finding peace, he finds death.
It's okay.
The film ends with John's funeral, and an all too familiar shot of Laura looking particularly grim. She's mourning for her husband, and the revelation occurs. John has the gift of foresight. And if we think back to the beginning of the film when John's persona suddenly changes before his daughter dies, we see this gift in action. If he has this gift though, why did he follow that figure? Doesn't he know he's going to die? John had a personal revelation when Christine died. He understood his gift and decided to shut it out because of grief.
She does not come
Because of his rejection of the thought of his dead daughter.
Christine is dead. She is dead. Dead, 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 dead.
Suspiria doesn't focus on grief. Its scope and avant-garde style floats beyond human emotion, and there's no way I can prepare you for that experience. The main reason I brought it up was because Luca Guadagnino's excellent horror film displays how far the genre has grown in the last decade. And as other great directors start dipping their toes into the horror genre, the boundaries of modern horror will become non-existent. Edgar Wright, the guy who made Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, has a psychological horror film slated to release this September. Who's next? Wes Anderson? Christopher Nolan? Movie makers now have the green light to create the horror films they've had on the back burners, because people love horror movies more now than ever. Why? Answering that question is what this whole video has been about. Why does grief pull us in? Why do we relate to broken, scared characters? Is it because of today's world? Are we consciously or subconsciously grieving for our dying planet? I don't know. But I know that grief is powerful and that empathy keeps us caring and keeps us watching. It's powerful enough to drive a man crazy, or to make a desperate, hurting mother try and bring their daughter back from the dead. These great horror films reflect a dark side of humanity, and yes, these stories are exaggerated, as all good drama is, but we still relate. Personally, I've been comforted by horror films. One of my first videos is all about that. I'll drop the link so you can check it out. I made this video because I still love horror movies. I still find comfort in them, and I wanted you to know why. So I started writing this script, and I watched a ton of horror movies, and grief just connected a lot of dots for me between a lot of my favorite films, and I hope it has for you too. Go watch Suspiria. Watch Don't Look Now. Let me know what you think. There's a lot more to that film that I didn't get into, and it demands rewatches. I expect to learn a lot more from my next viewing, because that's what great films do. Thank you so much for watching. Consider subscribing, like the video, and please share.